Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Finding America. The time is approximately 6 p.m. Central Time. I don't have an actual watch, so I'm just going to make that up for effect. And of course, it's not 6 p.m. Central Time. I lied. It would be, however, if we hadn't sprung the clocks forward this past weekend at the start of daylight saving time. And that got me thinking, why does America change its clocks? Now, firstly, before we get into the meat of all of this, I should clarify that changing of the clocks is something we do in Britain as well. But I was very curious to see if it was for the same reason or completely different reasons as to why the US does it. Now, we'll get onto those reasons here in just a second, but one thing is for sure, the time of the month at which we enter daylight savings time, it does differ from one country to the other. In the United States, currently in 2019, we spring forward on the second Sunday in March and fall back on the first Sunday in November. Ever so slightly different in the UK, where daylight savings, by the way, is known as British summertime. And in the UK, we spring forward on the last Sunday in March and we fall back on the last Sunday in October. As I said on Twitter yesterday, just US-UK time differences in general are fun. Usually I'm 6 hours behind the UK here in Chicago. But they're especially fun when one country alters its clocks and the other doesn't, and wine has happened. So, with that out of the way, let's take a look then at why the United States observes daylight saving time and how it all began. That's right, so at the start of the 20th century, there was this little war that you may have heard of called World War I, and that's where daylight savings time really got its start in life. I mean, it had been sort of floated about as an idea before then, but it was never really implemented by any country until Germany, or at least the German Empire, along with Austro-Hungary, did it in 1916. By the way, the reason that they did it was sort of an energy-saving measure, particularly pertaining to fuel during the war, particularly important at that time. And after they did it, a number of other European countries followed suit, even the enemies of Germany, including the UK, also in 1916, and just a bunch of other countries across Europe. But the United States held firm for another 2 years before they even entertained the idea, at which time the passage of the Standard Time Act occurred, again in 1918, and once again it was an energy-saving measure, and it was seen as a very valuable measure. Again, you were in the midst of a very big war, although unbeknownst to them at the time, it was coming to its close, and production was high, so they needed to maximize, I suppose, that daylight time and that efficiency that goes with longer daylight hours at that time. You can see here, in fact, in the US Capitol building, them changing the clocks during World War I to denote this. But soon after World War I came to a close in 1919, so 1 year after the end of the First World War, there was heavy opposition that came about from farming groups and things of that nature that said that it was troublesome for them, was problematic, and so many opposed this, and they lobbied to have that tenet, the tenet that dealt with the daylight savings time in the Standard Time Act, to have that repealed, and they were successful. The Senate, in fact, did repeal it despite a veto from Woodrow Wilson. It was one of the rare cases of a presidential veto being overrided by the Senate majority, and so that was done away with. It was thrown out. The only thing is that once it was thrown out and it wasn't no longer existed at the national level, it still stayed about at the state level, or at least in some states or some localities, like cities as well, through the next few years, throughout the next 20 years. And that would not have been a huge issue, except, once those 20 years had expired, another little known war broke out. It was called World War II. I think you guys know about it. You were involved. And because you were involved, by 1942, there's once again another effort to try to standardize this daylight savings across the United States. And President Franklin Roosevelt, did that very thing. He introduced daylight savings time across the nation once again, only this time it was year-round. So unlike today, it didn't just sort of start in March and then end in November. No, it was year-round. So you had that sort of additional hour for those 12 months. In fact, it turned out to be 3 years, because when he passed the act that would enact this daylight saving. It was written into this act that it would last the duration of the war and then some weeks thereon as well. So the war comes to a close in September 1945, and the United States, of course, along with the Allied powers, win that particular war. I think it's well documented at this point, and the United States then goes back to not having it nationalized across the country. However, just as after World War I, some states and cities, hang on to this idea of implementing daylight savings, and they stick with it. And so just as after 1918 and after World War I, you've got some hangers-on. You've got some states, some cities that want to keep it. California and Nevada kept their daylight savings time after 1945. And so you've got 20 years, another 20 years. It's sort of history repeating itself, just as World War II was in many ways. And you've got these states hanging on for the next 20 years until the mid-1960s, at which time you've got heavy lobbying from transportation groups wanting to reenact the idea of nationwide daylight savings time, because they were getting a lot of confusion. There was a lot of inconsistency across the country. And so in 1966, the Uniform Time Act passed, and it went into effect from 1967. So at that time, this act made it so that the states that wouldn't exempt themselves from this, which you could do according to this act, and we'll get onto that in just a second, but it made it so that daylight savings time at that point would go into effect on the last Sunday in April, all the way through to the last Sunday in October. Of course, it's changed quite a bit since then. It's been through quite a few amendments to that, and we are now at, as I said at the top of this show, the second Sunday in March through the first Sunday in November. But like I said a moment ago, this act did make it so that states could make themselves exempt from this, so long as the entire state did it. That's why, to this very day, with the exception of the Navajo Nation, the state of Arizona doesn't recognize daylight savings time. In fact, they trialed it in 1967, along with most of the rest of the nation, and didn't like it. There was a lot of pushback from people in Arizona. One of the chief reasons for that was stated at the time is that, Arizona is quite a hot state, especially during the summer, and so it would rather have those cooler hours in the morning be the preferred sort of extra daylight that they might get. So that, among many other reasons, which I won't get into right here, is why Arizona didn't do it. And to this day, Hawaii is the other state, along with a number of the US territories, do not recognize daylight savings time. In addition, in recent times, the states of California and Florida are also trying to make waves toward moving away from the idea. And the question is, in this day and age, in 2019, why do we still have it? Now, sure, during those summer months, it does provide additional daylight at the end of the working day, or indeed at the end of the school day, so that kids can play outside with their parents and all of that. In fact, one of the reasons that daylight savings was extended through November in the United States was to account for Halloween. Also, randomly, a study found that robberies occur at a lower frequency during DST and seems to be connected to that shift. But other than that, there aren't too many positives to take away from it in this day and age. The idea that this is somehow beneficial to the farming industry doesn't really hold up to scrutiny too well, especially when you consider that it was the farming industry that was opposing it 100 years ago. You want to talk about how nationally this is some sort of energy saver. Well, actually, a 2008 study done by the National Bureau of Economic Research found that, in fact, it increased energy consumption. So quite the opposite of what was intended. And, of course, it's just a pain in the arse. I mean, most people do consider it that way, I think. Remembering to change your clocks, although, of course, that's being somewhat alleviated now by digital clocks. But there's also the question of temporary sleep deprivation and things of that nature. But the real big question you could ask here, and many of you, in fact, may, is why don't we just go back to what FDR referred to as wartime? In other words, to have daylight saving time the whole year round. I mean, sure, there isn't a world war going on right now, but we could give it some other, pithy name like freedom time. And it doesn't look like I'm alone in thinking this way. A poll that was done in 2014 found that only a third of Americans found any value in daylight savings time. That was actually down from about 45% in 2012. And because 2014 is 5 whole years ago, I went ahead and did my own poll here on YouTube. The results will shock you. Maybe not that much. That's right. So of the 868 votes that have come in at the point of this recording, only 16% of you said that you thought that daylight saving time was necessary in the United States in 2019. 12% of you said you're not sure, and 72%, that's almost 3/4 of the entire nation, because, you know, this poll is scientifically sound, said no. So there you have it. It's not popular in this day and age to this very day. It looks like most of you think we should just do away with it. Let me know in the comments below what you think. Thanks for watching this video. And so if you agree with my stance here, why not share this video with the hashtag FreedomTime, and we'll see how far we can go. Maybe we'll go all the way to Congress with this. Thanks for watching. Bye. Thank you for watching this episode of Lost in the Pond. Don't forget to hit my stupid little face to subscribe, and please share this video with the world. Hit me up on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook, and if you would like to support this channel, please do so at patreon.com/lostinthepond.